The debate hall was electric. Cameras flashed as Senator Rand Paul's voice echoed through the room, sharp and dismissive. The tension was palpable, everyone knew this wouldn't be just another political exchange. This was different. The stakes were higher. The topic? Gun control, the one issue that divided America like no other. Rand Paul leaned into the microphone, his words cutting through the air. You want to take away people's rights. You want to punish law-abiding citizens for the actions of criminals. That's the kind of tyranny we're facing here. This is America. The Second Amendment is non-negotiable. The crowd shifted uncomfortably. There was a murmur, half of them nodded in agreement, while the others looked at each other, uneasy. But then, as if the air itself grew heavier, Kamala Harris stood. With an air of unshakable calm, she approached the microphone. It was almost as if time slowed. She adjusted her stance, her voice steady but fierce as it broke the uneasy silence. Senator Paul, she began, her eyes locking with his, you speak of rights, but let's talk about the rights of our children, our teachers, our families. What about their right to live without the fear that every time they step outside, they might not come back? The room fell silent. Kamala's voice rose with purpose, cutting through Paul's bluster like a blade. Senator, your defense of guns over lives isn't just wrong, it's dangerous. It's not about the Second Amendment. It's about greed, and it's about fear. And I'm not afraid to stand here and call it what it is. Rand Paul's face reddened, his lips tightening. He was used to dominating the debate, not being outmatched by a calm, collected woman standing before him. His grip on the podium tightened, as if to steady himself against the force of her words. And then, in a flash, the unexpected happened. The entire room, both sides, shifted. The crowd held its breath. The line had been crossed. Kamala Harris wasn't just answering him anymore. She had set the stage for something far more explosive than a political debate. What happened next left the nation in shock. For years, America had been caught in a vicious cycle. Mass shootings had become an all too frequent tragedy. Schools, churches, movie theaters, shopping malls, no place was safe. The numbers were staggering, over 40,000 gun-related deaths annually. And yet, year after year, Congress failed to pass meaningful legislation that could reduce the bloodshed. The issue of gun control had become the most polarizing topic in American politics. On one side, the gun rights advocates, the NRA and its loyal followers, argued that any attempt to regulate firearms was a violation of the Second Amendment. They painted any kind of reform as an attack on freedom itself. On the other side, there were those like Kamala Harris, who stood for the simple truth that American lives should never be put on the line for the sake of corporate profits and political ideology. Kamala Harris had seen the toll of unchecked gun violence firsthand. As California's Attorney General, she had worked to enforce stricter gun laws, but it was an uphill battle. Every attempt was met with fierce opposition from powerful lobbying groups, led by the NRA, who funneled millions into the political machine to ensure the status quo remained intact. But even as mass shootings continued to devastate families across the country, public opinion was beginning to shift. A new generation of Americans, millennials, Gen Z, were tired of being told to accept the violence as normal. The demand for change was growing louder. The country was divided, but the momentum was shifting. The conversation was no longer just about gun rights, it was about the right to live without fear. And in the midst of this national reckoning, Kamala Harris and Rand Paul were standing on opposite sides of the battlefield, representing two radically different visions of America's future. Kamala spoke for the people who had lost family members to senseless violence. She spoke for the mothers who feared for their children's safety at school. She spoke for the communities torn apart by gun-related deaths. In her eyes, this was not just a debate, it was a moral imperative to protect human life above all else. Rand Paul, on the other hand, stood as the embodiment of the entrenched political system, fueled by special interests, and willing to defend the rights of gun manufacturers over the rights of everyday citizens. His rhetoric was sharp, his stance unwavering. He spoke for the idea that freedom was paramount, even if it meant a few more funerals. As the debate between them escalated, the weight of history hung over the room. America's greatest moments of change had often come from fierce debates that divided the nation in the moment, but ultimately shaped the future. But what made this debate different was the urgency, the fear that this issue was no longer just a talking point, it was a national crisis. Kamala had already made her stance clear. But now, with the eyes of the nation on her, she was about to show the world that her fight for gun control was more than just policy, it was a fight for the future of America itself. The room was on edge. The audience could feel it, the stakes were higher than ever. This wasn't just a debate. This was the battle for the heart of America. This would be a turning point. A moment that would define the next chapter in the nation's history. Kamala stood ready, her heart pounding. She knew the risks, the power Rand Paul and his supporters wielded. But she also knew this: change was coming. The American people had spoken. It was time for their voices to be heard. But what happened next would change the course of the national conversation on gun rights forever. Rand Paul had built a career on one core principle: opposition. Opposition to government overreach. Opposition to regulation. Opposition to any and all attempts to disrupt the status quo, particularly when it came to one of the most sacred and volatile symbols of American freedom, the right to bear arms. From the moment he stepped into the political spotlight, Rand Paul made his stance clear. He was a warrior for personal liberty, a champion of individual rights, and most famously, the tireless defender of the Second Amendment. To Paul, this was not just about guns, it was about freedom itself. The government had no place in dictating what a citizen could or could not own. His ideology was unwavering. For him, the question was not whether gun control was effective, it was whether the government had the right to even entertain such an idea. Paul's ascent to power was fueled by his ability to sell this narrative to his base, a narrative of defiance, of standing up against a government he viewed as bloated, overreaching, and corrupt. The more he spoke of freedom, the more his audience grew, rallying behind the message that any attempt to regulate firearms was an affront to the very principles this nation was founded on. His speeches were punctuated with the phrase, "The Second Amendment shall not be infringed," a mantra that became the cornerstone of his political identity. But what Rand Paul failed to see, or perhaps refused to acknowledge, was the shifting landscape of America. A nation once proud of its rugged individualism was now reeling from tragedy after tragedy. Mass shootings had become a horrifyingly regular occurrence. Schools, malls, concerts, churches, everywhere, there was the possibility of a public massacre. And yet, Paul, in his ideological purity, stood firm. He refused to bend. To him, the carnage was an unfortunate cost of freedom. If people were dying in the streets, that was simply the price of liberty. His hypocrisy was hard to ignore. On the one hand, he railed against big government and the encroachment of regulations on individual freedoms. But on the other, he supported a system of unchecked corporate influence that flooded the political system with dark money. The NRA, the very organization that had lobbied for the deregulation of firearms for decades, poured millions into his campaigns. In exchange, he promised to protect their interests, no matter the cost. His political career was a delicate balance between public speeches about liberty and private backroom deals that guaranteed the status quo remained intact. But as the years went by, and more mass shootings became part of the national conversation, Rand Paul's rigid stance was becoming harder to justify. Public outrage reached a boiling point. The families of the victims, the mothers, the fathers, the children, could no longer remain silent. The cries for reform, for common-sense legislation that could save lives, echoed across the country. And yet, there stood Rand Paul, unapologetic, unmoved, offering only the same tired rhetoric about constitutional rights and the slippery slope of government control. He had made himself a political martyr, a champion of freedom at all costs, but it was a freedom that came with blood on its hands. His refusal to compromise was not rooted in principle, but in a desire to maintain power. In his mind, compromising on gun control wasn't about saving lives, it was about losing influence with his base, with the NRA, and with the political donors who lined his pockets. In that moment, the truth about Rand Paul became clear: he wasn't fighting for the rights of ordinary Americans. He was fighting to keep his grip on power, no matter the human cost. To those who followed him, Paul was a hero. A man who refused to bow to the forces of political correctness and government overreach. But to those who had lost loved ones to gun violence, to those who saw the devastation unfolding on a daily basis, he was a villain, someone who would rather protect the rights of an inanimate object than the lives of real people. And for many, that made him the epitome of everything wrong with American politics. The audience in the debate hall could feel it. The familiar arguments Paul was making, his constant refrain about freedom and rights, were no longer enough to shield him from the growing backlash. There was a palpable shift in the room, a sense that the tide was turning. Kamala Harris's calm, reasoned approach to the issue was beginning to strike a chord with the people. Paul, ever the ideologue, remained steadfast. But as the debate went on, the cracks in his armor began to show. His arrogance, the arrogance that had carried him so far in his career, was starting to betray him. He was the embodiment of the status quo, a man who had refused to evolve as the world around him changed. He had become an obstacle, not a solution. And what was once a strong political position was beginning to crumble under the weight of national tragedy and growing public demand for change. Rand Paul might have been fighting for the rights of gun owners, but in doing so, he was slowly becoming the villain in a story much larger than himself. The more he dug in his heels, the more he exposed the selfishness and short-sightedness of his position. The question no longer was whether his rhetoric could win over the masses, it was whether he could hold on to his narrative long enough to avoid being swept away by the wave of change that was coming. For Kamala Harris, this fight wasn't just about politics. It was personal. From the very beginning of her career, Kamala had witnessed the devastation of gun violence firsthand. As a former prosecutor, she had seen how easy it was for people to obtain weapons of mass destruction, guns that were often used to settle personal disputes, or worse, to terrorize entire communities. She had stood in courtrooms, looking into the eyes of victims' families, and felt their pain, the weight of their loss. Each life lost was a reminder that something had to change. And that something was the way America viewed gun rights. Kamala's journey to the Senate had been anything but easy. She was a daughter of immigrants, a woman of color, and a progressive in a political world dominated by power brokers who clung to outdated ideologies. Growing up in Oakland, California, she had seen both sides of the equation. She saw firsthand the communities affected by gun violence and the desperate need for reform. But she also understood the importance of law and order, and the role law enforcement played in protecting those same communities. It wasn't a simple issue for her, it never had been. This was a battle between safety and fear, justice and inaction, life and death. As California's Attorney General, Kamala Harris had fought tirelessly for stronger gun regulations. She had seen the effects of lax gun laws on her state, where gang violence, domestic abuse, and even routine street altercations often turned deadly because of easy access to weapons. But what frustrated her the most was the entrenched resistance she faced from the other side of the aisle, the very same forces Rand Paul now represented. Special interest groups like the NRA had poured millions of dollars into blocking her every effort. These forces didn't care about the lives at stake. They cared about profits, about preserving the status quo. Kamala had spent years trying to make sense of the pushback. She often found herself asking, how could people continue to put up barriers to common-sense gun reforms in the face of so much suffering? How could they sleep at night when so many innocent lives were being taken, their future stolen away by the pull of a trigger? The answer was simple: they didn't see it. To them, gun ownership was an issue of rights, not lives. But Kamala knew that for millions of families across America, it was about something far deeper, it was about survival. She had come to realize that this issue wasn't just about passing laws. It was about shifting the culture, about reimagining the relationship between citizens and their government, and between people and the weapons they held. Kamala wasn't just fighting for legislation, she was fighting for the people who had no voice, who had been forgotten by a system too concerned with its own power to care about the damage it caused. She wasn't a politician first. She was a mother, a sister, a daughter, someone who saw the struggle of everyday Americans and knew that something had to change. Rand Paul, with his rigid stance on gun rights, represented everything that was wrong with the system she was working to dismantle. His refusal to acknowledge the real-world consequences of his ideology, the suffering, the deaths, the heartbreak, was exactly the kind of political malpractice that Kamala had spent her life fighting against. His blind devotion to the Second Amendment, no matter the cost, was a defense of the status quo. It was a shield for those who were more concerned with power than people's lives. Kamala had learned early on that change would never come from those who had a vested interest in preserving the system. So, she made a decision. She would fight, not for the politicians, not for the donors, but for the people who needed change the most. She would challenge the powerful forces standing in the way of reform. And she would make sure that the voices of those affected by gun violence would finally be heard. What made Kamala uniquely suited to this fight was not just her political experience, but her personal history. She had a deep-seated belief that public service wasn't about power, it was about lifting people up, about ensuring that every American, regardless of their race, class, or background, had the opportunity to live in a safe and just society. Her background as a prosecutor gave her a rare insight into the damage that gun violence could inflict. She had seen the devastation up close, in courtrooms, in the streets, and in the eyes of those left behind. Rand Paul, with his narrow view of freedom, didn't understand this. To him, the Second Amendment was a bulletproof shield, one that he would defend at all costs, no matter the collateral damage. But Kamala's stance on gun control was born from a completely different place. She didn't view gun violence as an inevitable byproduct of freedom, she saw it as a national crisis, one that could no longer be ignored. She had spent years pushing for laws that would make communities safer, laws that would prevent the senseless deaths of children and families. She wasn't just another politician in a long line of lawmakers with empty promises. She had put in the work, time and time again, and now, standing across from Rand Paul in this high-stakes debate, Kamala knew this was her moment, her opportunity to make history. For all of Kamala's experiences, her struggles, and her victories, this was the defining moment of her career. The truth was simple, gun violence wasn't just an issue, it was a crisis that demanded action. And Kamala was the one who was prepared to take the battle head-on. She wasn't fighting for votes. She wasn't fighting for political gain. She was fighting for the lives of the American people. As the debate raged on, it became clear that Kamala Harris wasn't just here to argue. She was here to win. She was here to challenge the very system that Rand Paul represented, and, in doing so, she was ready to change the course of history. The room was thick with anticipation, the air heavy with the weight of the national conversation. Every word exchanged seemed to reverberate beyond the walls of the debate hall, touching the lives of millions who were watching, hoping for change, searching for clarity. Kamala Harris and Rand Paul stood on opposite ends of the ideological spectrum, each determined to win, but it was becoming increasingly clear that this was more than just a policy debate. This was personal. Rand Paul leaned into the microphone, his tone sharp, dripping with the confidence of a man who thought he had all the answers. He was no stranger to combative rhetoric, and tonight was no exception. His voice rose, accusing Kamala of trying to strip away the rights of law-abiding Americans, of encroaching on their freedoms, all in the name of political correctness and government control. "You're not fighting for freedom, Senator Harris," he snapped, his eyes narrowing with disdain. "You're fighting for tyranny. You want to disarm the people, make them dependent on the very government that has failed them for decades. This isn't about protecting lives, this is about control, and I won't stand for it." The crowd reacted in mixed waves of applause and jeers, but it was clear Rand Paul had hit his stride. His voice grew louder, more forceful, as he painted Kamala as a villain in a battle between liberty and oppression. But as the insults flew, something remarkable happened. Kamala Harris, standing across from him, never flinched. Her posture remained calm, her expression composed, as if she had anticipated this moment long before the debate had even begun. The tension in her eyes was not one of fear or anger, but of quiet determination. She knew the stakes, and she knew her moment was coming. She turned toward him, her voice steady but firm. "Senator, with all due respect," Kamala began, her words measured, "this isn't about government control. This is about the safety of our children, our teachers, our families. It's about protecting the rights of everyday Americans to live without the constant fear of gun violence." The contrast was immediate. Rand Paul's voice rang with the anger of a man trying to maintain control, clinging to a narrative that no longer held water. Kamala's voice, in contrast, was the calm center in a storm. Every word she spoke seemed carefully crafted, yet effortless, one meant not to stoke flames, but to extinguish them with truth. "Senator Paul," she continued, her gaze unwavering, "I understand that you believe in the rights of Americans to own firearms, but when those rights come at the expense of innocent lives, we have to ask ourselves, what is the cost of freedom? What is the cost when our children fear going to school, when parents fear letting their children out of the house?" Rand Paul's face tightened. He had expected a fight, a back and forth full of sharp words and cutting jabs. But instead, he found himself confronted by a steady force of reason, a woman whose resolve seemed to grow stronger with each word. And it was clear now, Kamala wasn't just standing for gun control. She was standing for the future of America. The crowd was on edge, sensing that something had shifted. Rand Paul's usual tactics, loud, fiery, and accusatory, were falling flat. His rhetoric, once so powerful, now seemed hollow. His attempts to discredit Kamala's position only seemed to highlight the weaknesses in his own. His next words were laced with frustration. "You can stand there and lecture me about safety, but let me tell you this, gun ownership isn't the problem. It's not the gun, it's the people who misuse it. You can't take away people's rights just because a few criminals ruin it for everyone else." But Kamala, unfazed, remained steady. "Senator, this isn't about taking away rights. This is about ensuring that the rights of our children, of our communities, are not trampled in the name of political ideology. It's about preventing the next shooting, the next tragedy." Rand Paul's jaw clenched. The crowd was beginning to turn. He could feel it, their patience thinning, their attention shifting. The more he spoke, the more he found himself cornered, unable to make the case he had so confidently arrived with. His usual swagger, his sharp barbs, had all but vanished. The man who had once made a name for himself as a fierce defender of liberty now looked like a man desperately trying to hold on to a crumbling ideology. Kamala, on the other hand, had never looked more certain. The calmness that radiated from her was becoming her weapon, more powerful than any insult, more cutting than any accusation. She wasn't just debating the issue of gun control, she was challenging the very premise of his position, pointing out the deep contradictions in his defense of a system that was failing the very people it was supposed to protect. "Senator," Kamala said, leaning in slightly, her voice calm but filled with purpose, "you keep talking about the rights of individuals, but you forget that the greatest right is the right to live. And until we can ensure that every American, from every community, has that right, we will continue to fail them." The room fell silent. There was no applause, no cheers, only the weight of her words hanging in the air. It was clear now, this wasn't just a debate about policy, it was a battle of values, a clash of worldviews. And Kamala Harris was winning. Rand Paul's face, red with frustration, betrayed him. His usual deflections weren't working. The room could see it, the more he fought, the more his position crumbled. Kamala was no longer just standing her ground. She was dismantling his arguments, piece by piece, and it was becoming painfully clear to everyone watching who was in control. Kamala Harris wasn't just another politician on a stage. She was a force of nature, resolute and unwavering, and she wasn't backing down. The debate hall was alive with tension. Rand Paul had given it his all, shouting, flailing, even calling Kamala's position a threat to American liberty. But the louder he became, the more desperate he seemed. He had thrown every rhetorical weapon he had in his arsenal, his attacks on the Second Amendment, his accusations of government tyranny, his threats of overreach. But none of it had landed. Kamala Harris, standing across from him, had yet to raise her voice. Her composure, her calm, were a stark contrast to the storm of emotion Paul had whipped up. And in that moment, something shifted. The crowd could feel it, like a pressure building, ready to explode. This wasn't just another point in a debate. This was the moment that would define everything. Kamala took a slow breath, her eyes scanning the room. It wasn't about her, not really. It was about the millions of Americans who woke up every day in fear that their children wouldn't come home from school, fear that the next mass shooting might happen on their block, in their neighborhood. Kamala wasn't standing for herself. She was standing for them. And now, she was going to make sure the world knew it. She looked directly at Rand Paul, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "Senator," she began, her tone measured but firm, "you keep talking about rights. But where are the rights of the children killed in Sandy Hook? Where are the rights of the victims in El Paso, or Parkland, or Las Vegas? The lives that have been lost because of your refusal to acknowledge that gun violence is a public health crisis. Where are their rights?" The room fell silent. Paul's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. He could feel the weight of her words sinking in, and for the first time, he was unsure of himself. Kamala wasn't done. She had merely begun. "Let's talk about the facts, Senator," she said, her voice gaining momentum, each word hitting harder than the last. "Since 2013, there have been 2,000 mass shootings in this country. Over 100,000 Americans have been killed by gun violence in the last decade alone. And what have we done? What have you done? You've blocked every single effort to make sure these deaths stop. You stand in the way of background checks, of banning assault rifles, of common-sense gun reforms that the majority of Americans are begging for." Her eyes never left his, and with each statistic, each piece of evidence, Rand Paul's bravado began to crack. "You want to talk about rights?" Kamala continued, her tone unwavering. "What about the right to live without fear? What about the right to walk down the street without wondering if today is the day a shooter will open fire? What about the right to send your children to school and not have to pray that they make it home?" She paused for effect, letting the silence hang in the air, giving her words time to settle in. "The truth is, Senator, you are more concerned with protecting the profits of the NRA than you are with the safety of the American people. You speak of freedom, but you ignore the very real consequences of the freedom you defend. How many more lives have to be destroyed before you listen? How many more children need to die before you act?" The audience was rapt, hanging on every word. The crowd's reaction was palpable, a mix of gasps, murmurs, and the quiet, collective realization that Kamala wasn't just making a point. She was delivering a verdict. Her argument was not based on ideology or rhetoric, it was rooted in truth, in human lives, in the lived experiences of millions of Americans who had suffered because of the very policies Rand Paul defended. Rand Paul's face was reddening. His confidence, once unshakable, was now crumbling. He began to sputter, trying to regain control, but the words came out in a jumbled mess. "Senator Harris, that's not true," he began, but his voice faltered. You're misrepresenting the issue. You're mischaracterizing." Kamala didn't let him finish. "Senator, you can continue to mischaracterize the facts all you want, but at the end of the day, the American people know the truth," Kamala fired back. "They know that the only thing standing between them and a safer future is a political system that refuses to prioritize their lives over political donations. They know that the NRA has bought off politicians like you to block reform, to keep this country locked in a cycle of violence." Her words hung in the air, sharp and undeniable. Kamala wasn't just accusing Rand Paul of negligence, she was accusing him of being complicit. She wasn't just making a case for gun control, she was making a moral argument, one that spoke to the heart of the nation's soul. For a brief moment, Rand Paul stood frozen. His usual deflections, his usual attacks, none of it was working. The room was watching him, waiting for a response, but he had nothing. Nothing left to say. His arrogance had been exposed for what it was, a defense of an outdated, dangerous status quo that had failed the American people time and time again. And the reality of that hit him like a freight train. Kamala Harris had taken the moral high ground, and she wasn't letting go. "I'm not here to attack your rights, Senator," Kamala said, her voice softening, but still filled with conviction. "I'm here to protect the rights of those who can no longer speak for themselves. The children who never made it home, the families who are burying their loved ones today, the mothers who won't ever hug their children again. Their rights are what matter." Rand Paul's face tightened, but this time, it wasn't in defiance. It was in frustration. His eyes darted around, looking for any way to reclaim control, but it was too late. The audience had already decided. His arguments, once so forceful, now seemed hollow, empty, as if they had no weight behind them. Kamala's calm, fact-driven response had shattered his arguments like glass. He had no comeback. No defense. He was cornered. The crowd, sensing the shift in the air, erupted into applause. The room buzzed with approval, not just for her logic, but for the way Kamala had handled the moment. It wasn't just the facts that had won the day, it was her grace, her determination, her unwavering commitment to the truth. The impact of the debate reverberated far beyond the debate hall. As soon as the broadcast ended, social media erupted. It was as if a dam had broken, a torrent of reactions flooded platforms like Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok. The hashtags started to pour in almost instantly, hashtag Kamala owns Paul, hashtag truth over tyranny, hashtag gun control now. Within minutes, Kamala Harris's calm yet devastating counterattack had gone viral, and the internet couldn't get enough. Thousands of tweets praising Kamala's factual, moral, and composed response flooded timelines. Clips of her mic drop moment, where she dismantled Rand Paul's arguments with cold, undeniable truth, were shared and reshared, viewed millions of times. The emotion behind her words, her unwavering commitment to those who had lost their lives to gun violence, connected with people in a way few political moments ever had. One viral meme showed a split screen, on the left, Rand Paul, flustered and defensive, his arms thrown wide in exaggerated disbelief, on the right, Kamala Harris standing tall, her arms crossed, exuding calm and control. The caption read, "When facts meet fantasy." A post from a prominent gun control advocate went viral. "This is the moment the gun control movement has been waiting for. This is Kamala's legacy, speaking the truth when the nation needed it most." Rand Paul's supporters, on the other hand, scrambled to defend him, but the damage had already been done. For every tweet trying to downplay Kamala's points, there were 10 more calling out his inability to stand up to the facts. His mentions were flooded with taunts, mocking his weak response and his failure to address the real issues. "The NRA is shaking," one tweet read, "because they just saw how badly their puppet floundered on live TV." Another read, "Is Rand Paul going to apologize for letting Kamala Harris teach him what it means to defend the American people?" For a man whose career had been built on staunch defense of the Second Amendment, it was a blow he couldn't recover from in real time. The question on everyone's mind was simple: how could he continue to represent the will of the people when it was so obvious that his position had failed to protect them? The ripple effect from the debate spread quickly through political circles. Commentators across the ideological spectrum weighed in. On one hand, conservative pundits tried to rally behind Rand Paul, doubling down on the talking points of gun rights and individual freedoms. They tried to push the narrative that Kamala's appeal to emotions, while powerful, didn't offer real solutions. But even they couldn't ignore the fact that she had effectively dominated the conversation, leaving Paul's rhetoric in tatters. On the other hand, progressive voices took to the airwaves and social media, celebrating Kamala's performance. Political commentators on MSNBC, CNN, and independent platforms hailed her as the voice of reason, someone who didn't just call out the problem but presented a clear path forward. Kamala Harris showed America tonight what it means to put people over politics, said one political analyst. She didn't just debate the issue, she won the moral argument. Even more unexpected was the growing chorus of support from public figures who had previously been on the fence about stricter gun laws. Senators and representatives from swing states, some of whom had long feared crossing the NRA, began to shift their tone. A tweet from Senator Cory Booker read, "Kamala's words today are a wake-up call. We can no longer afford to ignore the bloodshed. We must act." There was also a noticeable shift in public perception. Gun control advocates saw this moment as a tipping point, the beginning of a new chapter in their fight for safer gun laws. Political polling after the debate showed a significant rise in support for stricter regulations. A new survey revealed that 68% of Americans now supported universal background checks for gun purchases, and 56% backed a nationwide ban on assault rifles, both measures that Kamala had passionately advocated for during the debate. The tide was turning, and Kamala Harris's leadership had played a pivotal role in shifting that conversation. At the same time, Rand Paul found himself on the defensive in the days that followed. His usual social media mentions, which were often flooded with support from his loyal base, now contained a far more significant number of voices calling for him to reconsider his position. Calls for his resignation or for him to apologize to the families of gun violence victims started circulating. The man who had once prided himself on being the staunch defender of American freedoms was now being painted as an obstructionist, someone who put the interests of the NRA ahead of the safety and lives of the people he was elected to protect. Kamala's words, the ones that had sliced through the debate with surgical precision, began to take on a life of their own. They were quoted by activists, broadcast in ads, and used in speeches across the country. The stark contrast between her reasoned compassion and Rand Paul's fear-driven ideology had become a symbol of a larger battle, not just over gun control, but over the very soul of American politics. While Rand Paul's political career was not yet finished, the seeds of doubt had been planted. He had lost the moral high ground, and as the nation watched, it became clear that the battle was no longer just about defending the Second Amendment, it was about defending the lives of Americans from senseless violence. In the weeks that followed, Kamala's campaign for gun control gained momentum. States began considering more robust gun laws, with several governors citing her debate performance as the spark for their renewed efforts. The debate had not just been about guns. It had been about leadership, about who was willing to step forward and do what was right, no matter the cost. And Kamala Harris had done exactly that. She had become the voice of a movement, the hero who stood tall in the face of a broken system, and for millions of Americans, her words had become a rallying cry. The dust had settled. The debate was over, but its aftermath would reverberate for years to come. Kamala Harris had delivered a victory, not just in the form of a decisive argument, but in the restoration of the fundamental values that Americans once held dear: safety, dignity, and the collective well-being of every citizen. In a moment of unparalleled clarity, she had shown that the true fight was not over political ideology or party lines, it was over the future of the nation itself. As the applause from the debate hall began to fade, Kamala stood before the cameras. The nation was watching, waiting for her to speak the words that would define this moment. "Tonight, we've seen the stark contrast between two visions for America," Kamala began, her voice steady, yet filled with conviction. "One vision that continues to put the rights of the few over the safety of the many, and another that puts the people first. It's easy to talk about rights when you're not the one burying a child, or standing at the grave of a friend who never had the chance to walk down the street again." Her words, though tempered with sadness, carried an undeniable force, one that spoke to the hearts of everyone who had been touched by the pain of gun violence. "This debate," she continued, "has never been about taking away rights. It's been about recognizing that we have a responsibility to protect the people we love, the communities we care about, and the future we want to build for our children." She paused, allowing the weight of her words to sink in. "Tonight, I'm not asking for a political victory," she said, her voice growing stronger. "I'm asking for a moral one. I'm asking for us to choose compassion over fear, reason over rhetoric, and most importantly, for us to choose life over ideology. Kamala's message transcended the boundaries of the debate. This wasn't just a call for gun control. This was a call for a nation to reclaim its sense of decency, its sense of community. It was about recognizing that the real measure of any country, any society, is not how many freedoms it protects, but how well it protects its people. And in that moment, Kamala had made it clear, the right to live free from fear was the most fundamental of all. In the end, the fight we're in isn't about rights versus restrictions, Kamala said, her eyes searching the camera, connecting directly with the millions watching from home. It's about making sure that every American has the right to feel safe, to know that when they send their children to school or when they step into their neighborhood, they aren't walking into a battlefield. It's about making sure that the people we represent, not the powerful interest groups, are the ones who matter most. Her words were a clear challenge to the status quo, an assertion that the time for empty promises and hollow rhetoric had passed. Kamala was calling on every person who believed in justice, in dignity, in life itself, to rise up. The country had been fighting this battle for far too long, and she wasn't going to let it slide back into the depths of inaction. This victory isn't just mine, Kamala continued, it's for every mother who has lost a child to senseless violence. It's for every family who has waited years for change, for every community that has been shattered by tragedy. This is our moment, our chance to do what's right. And I will continue to fight, not because it's easy, but because it's necessary. Her voice was unwavering, not just with determination, but with the kind of conviction that made it clear this wasn't just another debate, it was the beginning of something much larger. Kamala wasn't just making a political argument, she was waging a moral one, and in doing so, she was leading the country toward a better, safer, more compassionate future. The question we face now isn't whether we can make change, Kamala said. The question is whether we will. She paused, letting that question linger in the air. The weight of it was undeniable. The country had been presented with a choice, a stark, defining choice. And in that moment, it became clear that Kamala Harris wasn't just a politician on a stage. She was the voice of the American people, speaking for a nation that had had enough. Her final words were simple, but their power was immeasurable. We are better than this. And together, we will build a future where our children can grow up safe, where our communities are strong, and where the values of justice and dignity triumph over fear and division. As Kamala stepped away from the podium, the crowd erupted into applause, but it wasn't just the applause of those gathered in that room. It was the applause of every American who had heard her message, every person who believed that this was the moment to act, the moment to ensure that the future would be brighter for generations to come. The debate was over. But the fight, for gun control, for justice, for the future of America, was just beginning. Kamala Harris's words tonight weren't just a political argument, they were a call to action. A call for each and every one of us to stand up and demand the kind of change that can save lives. Tonight, she reminded us of the stakes, our children's safety, our communities' futures, and the very soul of America. We can no longer afford to sit idly by as the voices of those who have lost so much go unheard. We can no longer pretend that inaction is an option. This fight is about more than just policies. It's about doing what's right for every American, regardless of political affiliation, race, or background. So now, more than ever, we need to stand together. We need to demand a future where our children are safe, where common sense prevails, and where truth wins out over fear and division. But it doesn't stop here. Kamala's victory tonight was just the beginning. We all have a role to play. Whether it's speaking out, voting for leaders who will stand up for gun control, or simply sharing this message, every action counts. Join the movement. Share this video with your friends, your family, and your community. Use your voice. Let's make sure that the fight for gun control doesn't end in the halls of the debate stage, it ends with real, meaningful change that protects lives and ensures a brighter future for us all. We've seen what happens when we stand up for what's right. Now, it's time to keep fighting, to keep pushing, and to never let the voices of the voiceless be silenced again. The time for change is now. Let's make our voices heard.